It began in a quiet Austrian town where the streets looked like postcards, white fences, tidy gardens, and neighbors who smiled but never lingered too long. Amstetten was the kind of place where people trusted one another, where nothing truly dark was ever supposed to happen. But beneath one of those houses, behind a steel door that no one knew existed, a secret grew for 24 years, hidden by concrete, fear, and silence. For most people, monsters are things from bedtime stories. For one young woman, the monster was her father. His name was Josef Fritzl. To the world above, he was an engineer, a husband, a father of 7. To the world below, he was something else entirely, the architect of a private hell. On the 19th of April 2008, a 19-year-old girl named Kirsten was rushed to a hospital in a critical state. Doctors were stunned. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. She could barely speak. Her blood showed extreme vitamin deficiency, the kind seen in people who had never been outside. When they asked for her mother, a trembling woman appeared, eyes hollow, voice broken. Her name was Elisabeth Fritzl, the woman who had vanished 24 years earlier. As investigators followed her into the sunlight, the truth began to surface, a truth that would horrify the entire world. For over 2 decades, Elisabeth had been locked beneath her own home, trapped in a windowless cellar, and forced to bear the children of the man who built it. Sirens tore through Amstetten that night. Reporters flooded the street. Neighbors stared in disbelief, whispering that such things didn't happen here. But they did, quietly, methodically, for half a lifetime. Sometimes evil doesn't come from the shadows. Sometimes it builds a home and lives right underneath yours. Before the cellar became a prison, it was just another basement in a quiet suburban house. To anyone passing by, the Fritzl home on Elisabeth looked perfectly ordinary, a 2-story building with flower boxes in the windows, a tidy garage, and the sound of children playing echoing from the garden. Behind that neat facade lived Josef Fritzl, a man who, on the surface, represented everything respectable in small-town Austria. Born in 1935, Josef grew up in post-war hardship. He became an engineer, married a woman named Rosemary, and together they built what looked like an ideal family. He was intelligent, methodical, and disciplined. But beneath that calm exterior was something else, a deep need for control. Those who knew him described him as strict and private, a man whose word was law in his home. He spoke little, smiled even less, and carried a sense of superiority that made people step back without knowing why. His wife Rosemary was quiet, obedient, and deeply religious. She never questioned his moods. When Josef worked on home renovations, she simply assumed he was being practical, meticulous, like all engineers. No one noticed how his projects grew stranger over the years. He began spending long hours in the basement, expanding it, reinforcing it, always alone. He told the neighbors he was building a shelter, just in case. In the Cold War era, that explanation sounded reasonable. Nobody asked to see it. Among his 7 children, Elisabeth stood out. She was shy, kind, and curious about the world beyond their small town. As a teenager, she dreamed of traveling, working with children, and escaping her father's oppressive rules. But Josef had other plans. He watched her closely, punished her for small acts of rebellion, and made sure she never had too many friends. To outsiders, he was the model patriarch. Inside those walls, he ruled with quiet, absolute power. By the early 1980 seconds, tension in the house had thickened like dust. Elisabeth tried to leave home once, but her father forced her back, saying she wasn't ready for the world. She was 18 when Josef told her he needed help installing a new door in the basement, a small favor, just for a moment. That moment became a lifetime. No one in Amstetten noticed the silence that followed. Rosemary believed Josef when he said their daughter had joined a religious commune and didn't want to be found. The police received a missing persons report, but with no signs of crime, they let it fade into paperwork. The neighbors whispered, then forgot. Life continued above ground while below, a new world was being built from fear and concrete. In that small Austrian town, the Fritzl family went on appearing normal. But the house at Elisabeth was no longer just a home. It was a stage set beautiful on the outside, rotten beneath. And in that darkness, the first brick of the cellar's secret had already been laid. No one knew that in a few hours the sound of a closing metal door would mark the end of one life and the beginning of another. It was the 28th of August 1984. The late summer air hung thick over Amstetten, the kind of evening when the streets went quiet early and the houses sealed themselves in stillness. In the Fritzl home, Josef called his 18-year-old daughter Elisabeth to the basement. He said he needed help carrying something, just a quick task before dinner. She hesitated but obeyed, like she always had. The door to the cellar was heavy, made of reinforced steel. Josef had spent years building it himself, brick by brick, deepening the space beneath the house. He claimed it was a bomb shelter, a remnant of old fears from the Cold War. But what he built was not protection, it was captivity. When Elisabeth stepped inside, he followed and closed the door behind her. There was a hiss of air, the clank of the lock sliding in. She turned around confused, perhaps nervous, and in that instant, everything she knew disappeared. He pressed a rag to her face, and when she awoke, she was chained to the wall. The first night was silence and confusion. The basement was small, a few meters wide, ceiling low enough that Josef had to stoop. The air smelled of damp concrete and dust. There was a single light bulb that hummed weakly, its glow barely cutting through the dark. The floor was rough, cold under her skin. She screamed for hours, but no one heard. Above her, her mother made dinner, unaware that her daughter was just a few meters below. Josef came back the next day with food and a warning. "You belong to me now," he said. The words were flat, practical, as if he were stating a rule of physics, not a horror. Over the following days, he reinforced the space with concrete, soundproofing, and locks. Each improvement made the walls feel tighter, the air heavier. The first assault came soon after. It was not sudden or loud. It was deliberate. Josef's cruelty was calculated, mechanical, emotionless. Elisabeth was left bleeding, shaking, and numb. In the darkness, she tried to tell herself it was a nightmare, that someone would open the door and end it, but no one came. The world above continued without her. Josef told his wife and neighbors that Elisabeth had run away to join a sect. Days turned into weeks, and the story began to settle into local gossip, a rebellious teenager, gone her own way. Meanwhile, in the cellar, reality was shrinking. Josef visited almost every night. He brought food, clothing, and later a television, books, and even a refrigerator. To him, it was maintenance. To her, it was survival. Years blurred together. The seasons outside meant nothing underground. Elisabeth learned the rhythm of his steps, the metallic echo of the key turning, the creak of the hinges, the smell of his cologne mixed with mold. She marked time by the hum of the ventilation system and the flicker of the light. In 1988, she gave birth for the first time. Josef helped, holding a flashlight while she screamed. There was no doctor, no anesthesia, only a towel and a bucket of water. The child's cries filled the narrow room, a sound that was both life and punishment. Josef looked at the baby and smiled. He would name her. More children followed, 7 in total over the years. One shortly after birth, Josef took the tiny body and disposed in the house. 3 were brought upstairs, presented to his wife as foundlings, left by their runaway daughter. He forged letters from Elisabeth, claiming she had sent the babies because she could not care for them. Rosemarie believed him. She fed them, dressed them, and even thanked the missing girl in her prayers. 3 others and their mother stayed below. They lived by the glow of artificial light, their bodies pale, their voices low. The children drew pictures of the sun they had never seen. Their world was concrete walls, a small stove, and a locked door that never opened. Every few weeks, Josef would bring new supplies. Sometimes he would watch them eat. Sometimes he would turn off the light, just to remind them who controlled it. Elisabeth learned not to cry anymore. She learned that silence was safer than hope. Outside, the years passed. The Berlin Wall fell. The world changed. But in Amstetten, time stood still. The cellar remained sealed, its secret intact. 24 years of captivity. 24 years of darkness. Until one day, in 2008, the world above finally noticed a girl who had never seen the sun, and the door to hell began to crack open. It began, as so many endings do, with something small, a sickness no one could ignore. In April 2008, 19-year-old Kirsten, the eldest of the children born in the cellar, fell gravely ill. Her body was frail, her skin ghostly white from a lifetime without sunlight. She could barely stand, her immune system collapsing under years of isolation. Elisabeth begged her father for help. For once, Josef hesitated. He knew that letting the girl leave would risk everything he'd built. But as Kirsten's breathing grew shallow, even his obsession with control began to crack. On April 19th, Josef carried his unconscious daughter up the narrow stairs and placed her outside. leaving a note in Elisabeth's handwriting that pleaded for medical help. Hours later, Kirsten was admitted to the Amstetten hospital. The doctors were alarmed not just by her condition, but by what they couldn't explain. Her body showed signs of severe vitamin deficiency and organ stress, usually seen in people deprived of sunlight for years. Her hair was brittle, her teeth weak. She spoke in strange fragments, afraid of voices. When the doctors requested to meet her mother, Josef appeared, calm as always. He explained that Kirsten's mother, Elisabeth, had joined a religious sect years ago and refused to appear in public. But his story didn't fit. The doctors noticed the girl's behavior, her fear, the way she flinched at loud sounds. They called the police. Investigators questioned Josef, politely at first. He repeated his story. His daughter had disappeared decades ago, joined a commune, and occasionally left babies at his doorstep. The police had heard that version before, back in the 1,980 seconds. It had sounded strange then. Now, it was impossible. They demanded to see Elisabeth. That night, under pressure he could no longer bear, Josef returned to the cellar. He told Elisabeth what had happened, that the police were asking questions, that they wanted to see her. After 24 years underground, Elisabeth stepped into the night for the first time. The world outside was too bright, too loud. The air itself felt foreign. At the hospital, the moment she saw Kirsten, something inside her broke and then rebuilt itself. Surrounded by police and doctors, Elisabeth decided the secret would die that night. She agreed to speak, but only if she never had to see Josef again. When investigators entered the Fritzl house with her, what they found defied comprehension. The entrance to the cellar was hidden behind a series of doors and corridors, sealed by an electronically locked steel door weighing over half a ton. Inside were small rooms, a makeshift kitchen, a sleeping corner, a bathroom cobbled together from plastic and pipes. The ceilings were low, the air stale. Toys, children's clothes, drawings of suns and trees covered the walls. A family had lived there. A family the world had never seen. Elisabeth spoke for hours. Her voice was calm, deliberate, as if she had rehearsed the story 1,000 times in her head. She described how her father built the cellar, how he visited almost every night, how he controlled every breath they took. She told them about the births, the beatings, the years without daylight, the children who asked her what the sky was. When the police confronted Josef, he sat quietly, his face unreadable. Then he said, "Yes, it's true. I did it. I kept them down there." No rage, no tears, just a man acknowledging a system he had engineered and maintained for nearly a quarter of a century. News spread like wildfire. Reporters crowded the small Austrian town, flashing cameras against the facade of the Fritzl house. Neighbors stood outside in disbelief, remembering the man who smiled politely, the man who lent them tools, who seemed so ordinary. "He was always nice," one said. "He even built my fence." Forensic teams sealed the home. They measured every wall, every pipe, every trace of the hidden structure. The cellar was a labyrinth, precise, deliberate, soundproof. It had taken years of planning and thousands of hours of labor to construct. He had built it under the very place his wife and children lived, while none of them suspected what was beneath their feet. As Elisabeth and her children were taken to safety, the cellar door was locked one final time. But this time, it was not to keep someone in. It was to make sure no one ever entered again. The monster had been unmasked, but for the survivors, the nightmare was only beginning. When the truth finally reached the courtroom, it was as if all of Austria had stopped to listen. In March 2009, Josef Fritzl, now a pale, stooped 73-year-old man, was brought before the regional court of Street Polten. Cameras flashed as he entered, shielding his face behind a blue folder, the image that would come to symbolize the shame of an entire nation. Reporters called it the trial of the century. But for Elisabeth, who sat in a private room far away, it was not about spectacle. It was about reclaiming the years stolen from her and the children who had grown up in the dark. The charges read like a catalog of human depravity: rape, false imprisonment, coercion, incest, and murder. Cellar. The courtroom was silent as the judge listed each one. Josef barely moved. His lawyer spoke of his troubled childhood, his need for control, his split personality, but none of it mattered. The facts spoke louder than any excuse. During the proceedings, Elisabeth faced her father for the first time since the night she was freed. She did not speak, she did not have to. The sight of her standing there, a woman who had endured 24 years of silence, was enough. As her testimony was played to the court, even seasoned officers turned away. Her voice was calm, steady, devoid of anger. "He took everything from me," she said, "but he did not break me." The evidence was irrefutable. The Cellar's blueprints, the DNA tests proving Josef was the father of all the children, the diary entries Elisabeth had written on scraps of paper to keep her sanity, they all told the same story. Psychiatrists described Josef as a narcissistic, authoritarian personality with no capacity for empathy. He had built a double life, a normal man above, a tyrant below. They concluded he was fully aware of what he was doing, that every act had been deliberate, every visit calculated. He had even timed the deliveries of supplies so that no one would notice the missing food or electricity usage. When the verdict came, it felt less like justice and more like the faint light at the end of a long tunnel. Josef Fritzl was found guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment in a psychiatric unit within a maximum security prison. He would never walk free again. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, holding candles for Elisabeth and her children. Reporters broadcast the outcome across the world, the story now a permanent scar in the collective memory of Austria. Politicians called for reforms, for closer community vigilance, for stronger systems to protect victims of domestic abuse, but none of it could erase what had happened. Elisabeth and her children were moved to a protected facility. The younger ones were introduced to sunlight for the first time, their eyes shielded with glasses because the brightness hurt. They learned to walk on grass, to feel wind, to recognize rain. Simple things became miracles. Josef in prison requested photos of them. His lawyer said he wanted to know how they were doing. The request was denied. As of 2025, he remains in a secure psychiatric facility, old, frail, and largely forgotten. He no longer speaks of the cellar. He spends his days in isolation, a fitting symmetry to the life he once imposed on others. Justice in this case did not restore what was lost, but it ensured one thing: the door that once opened to hell would never open again. When the cellar was sealed for the last time, the world above seemed to breathe again. But for those who had lived beneath it, freedom was not a moment. It was a slow, uncertain rebirth. Elisabeth and her children were taken to a hidden rehabilitation center in northern Austria, where therapists and doctors tried to piece together what 24 years of captivity had broken. In those early months, silence was still their first language. The children, who had never known sunlight, would shrink at open windows. They mistook the chirping of birds for machines. Even the concept of outside had to be taught: the wind, the smell of rain, the way light changes through a day. They were like souls emerging from another world, learning to live again among the living. Elisabeth, now in her 40s, faced a new kind of prison, one without walls, but built from memories. The past lived inside her, the sound of footsteps on metal stairs, the feel of cold air when the door opened, the dread that lingered long after it closed. Yet she refused to be defined by him. She focused on her children, teaching them kindness, patience, and the truth that they were born in darkness, but not made of it. Austria, as a nation, grappled with the aftermath. How could something so monstrous have gone unnoticed for so long? Neighbors questioned their own blindness, their willingness to accept a man's strange habits without curiosity. Governments strengthened welfare and child protection systems, but the unease remained. The case became a mirror not just of one man's evil, but of the comfort of ignorance. Documentaries and films would later try to reconstruct the unimaginable. Psychologists studied the case to understand trauma, control, and the human mind's capacity for survival. But the true story, the one that mattered, belonged only to Elisabeth and her children, their quiet journey toward reclaiming life. In 2013, it was reported that Elisabeth had built a new home with her family, under a new name, guarded by trees and silence. She no longer gave interviews. She rarely left her village, but those who have seen her say that she smiles sometimes, not often, but enough to know that she's still here. Meanwhile, the house in Amstetten still stands. The upper floors have been renovated, but the cellar remains sealed concrete poured over every entrance. Locals walk past without looking. They say the air around it still feels colder. This story is not about the man who built that cellar. It is about those who climbed out of it. Because evil leaves behind more than scars, it leaves echoes, faint but enduring, that remind us how thin the walls are between safety and horror. And as we turn away from this story, one question lingers in the quiet. Do we truly know the people who live beneath our roofs? Or only the faces they choose to show us?